Raven stood, her decision made. Dr. Reed, work with first speaker Thera. I want to know everything about this containment field. Parker, Jin, start running simulations on nebula stabilization patterns. If there's a human solution to this, we're going to find it. Commander, Thera's voice had dropped to a resonant whisper. You should know, if we fail, the weapon's effect will cascade. First this sector, then neighboring systems. Earth is not as far from here as you might wish. Then we better not fail. Raven met the alien's compound eyes steadily. This is what we do, first speaker. We face impossible problems and find impossible solutions. It's kind of our specialty. The next hours were a blur of activity. The Horizons labs were converted into research stations, human and Viridian scientists working side by side. Raven watched as Dr. Reed and Thera pored over ancient containment field schematics, their size difference almost comical if the stakes weren't so high. The field requires a specific quantum frequency to maintain stability, Thera explained, their scales shifting between technical diagrams. But the power requirements increase exponentially over time, like trying to hold back a tide with a wall that keeps needing to be higher. Reed mused. But what if we didn't try to hold it back? What if we redirected it instead? Raven saw the moment Thera's scales shifted to bright green. Pure curiosity. Explain. As Reed launched into a complex theory about quantum wave dynamics, Raven smiled slightly. This was humanity at its best, facing cosmic horror with scientific innovation and stubborn determination. But as another energy surge rocked the ship, she knew they were running out of time. The diplomatic dance was over. Now it was time for humanity to show why even 9-foot-tall ancient guardians might need their help. The Horizon's engine core thrummed with barely contained power as Dr. Reed's experimental quantum resonance field took shape. Raven watched from the observation deck as ribbons of energy stretched between their ship and the Viridian vessel, creating a new kind of containment web around the writhing nebula. Your scientist's theory is unconventional, Thera said from behind her, their massive form reflected in the reinforced viewport. Much like your species. Unconventional is what we do best, Raven replied, turning to face the Viridian. Though I notice you haven't told your high command about our attempt yet. Thera's scales rippled with deep crimson. The color Raven had finally identified as conflict. The collective would not approve of sharing such sensitive operations with younger species. You mean they'd rather let the weapon destroy half the galaxy than admit they need help? Raven's voice carried an edge of frustration. Your pride could cost billions of lives. Our pride. Thera's massive form seemed to expand slightly. We have guarded this sector for millennia while your people were still discovering fire. We have sacrificed generations to contain this threat. And now you're about to sacrifice everything, because you can't admit times have changed. Raven stepped closer, having to crane her neck to meet Thera's compound eyes. You said you needed humanity's gift for finding new solutions. Well, this is it. It's messy, it's unorthodox, and it might just save everyone. The ship shuddered as another energy surge pulsed through the nebula. Warning lights flashed across nearby consoles. Containment field at 30%. Lieutenant Jin's voice came through the comm. Dr. Reed's resonance web is holding, but the power draw is massive. Thera's scales shifted through multiple patterns before settling on a deep blue. There is one way. A challenge ritual. If a representative of humanity could prove their worth in combat against a Viridian champion, the collective would be honor-bound to consider their proposal. Combat. Raven raised an eyebrow. Against someone 3 times our size with natural armor. The challenge can be declined. I'll do it. Thera's scales flashed with surprise. Commander, you can it. I can, and I will. Raven's dark eyes held steady. You need the collective's approval to implement Reed's solution. I need to keep my ship and crew safe. Seems like a fair trade. The next hour was a flurry of preparation. The Horizon's cargo bay was cleared and converted into a makeshift arena. Crew members gathered around the edges, trying to hide their concern as Raven stripped down to her basic tactical gear. "This is suicide," Dr. Reed hissed as she helped Raven warm up. "Their bone density alone makes them nearly indestructible." "Nearly isn't completely," Raven replied, stretching her shoulders. "Besides, sometimes you have to be crazy to be right." The Viridian champion was even larger than Thera, their scales a pattern of aggressive reds and blacks. They carried no weapons. They didn't need any. "The challenge is until submission," Thera announced, their voice carrying across the cargo bay. "No permanent damage is permitted." They paused, scales showing concern. "Commander, you may still withdraw." Raven rolled her shoulders. "Not a chance. First speaker. Let's dance." The fight began explosively. The Viridian champion moved with shocking speed for their size, massive fists creating air pressure waves as Raven dodged. She kept moving, using her smaller size and greater agility to stay just out of reach. "Stand and fight, human." The champion bellowed, their scales pulsing with frustration. "Why?" Raven ducked another massive swing. "Because that's what you expect. That's your problem. You think there's only one way to solve things." She rolled between the champion's legs, noting how they had to turn their whole body to track her. Big meant powerful, but it also meant less maneuverability. Physics was physics, no matter how advanced the species. The ship shuddered again as another energy surge hit. Raven used the momentum to launch herself upward, catching a ceiling support beam. The champion's frustrated roar echoed through the cargo bay. "You hide like a pest," they accused. "I adapt," Raven corrected, swinging to another beam. "Like when we found your containment field was failing. We didn't try to overpower the problem. We found a new approach." She dropped suddenly, landing on the champion's broad shoulders. Before they could react, she hooked her legs around their throat, using their own momentum as they tried to shake her off. "Your strength is impressive," Raven continued, tightening her hold as the champion staggered. "But strength isn't everything. Sometimes you need to look at problems differently." The massive aliens' movements were becoming erratic as their oxygen was restricted. Raven held on, even as their powerful arms tried to reach her. "The nebula weapon isn't going to care how strong you are," she managed through gritted teeth. "It's not going to respect your ancient traditions. It's going to destroy everything unless we work together." The champion finally dropped to their knees, their scales fading to dull colors. Raven maintained her hold for another few seconds before releasing them, rolling away and coming up in a defensive stance. The cargo bay was silent except for the champion's heavy breathing. Then, slowly, their scales shifted to a color Raven had never seen before, a deep, respectful gold. "The human speaks truth," they rumbled, rising to their feet, "and fights with honor, if not convention. I submit." A murmur ran through the gathered crew as Thera stepped forward, their own scales showing a complex pattern of emotions. "The challenge is complete," they announced. "The collective must now consider humanity's proposal." They turned to Raven, who was trying not to show how much the fight had taken out of her. "You continue to surprise us, Commander." "Good," Raven managed to smile. "Because we're just getting started. Now let's go save the galaxy, together." As the crew dispersed and preparations began to present Dr. Reed's solution to the collective, Raven caught Thera studying her with their compound eyes. "You could have been killed," the first speaker said softly. "Sometimes you have to risk everything to prove you're right," Raven replied. "I thought your people would understand that, given what you've sacrificed to contain the weapon." Thera's scales shifted to that new golden hue. "Perhaps we have more in common than we realized, Commander. Though your methods remain unconventional." "I'll take that as a compliment." Raven straightened despite her aching muscles. "Now, shall we go convince your leaders that unconventional is exactly what we need right now?" The Viridian Collective's central chamber made Raven feel like she had wandered into the heart of a living crystal. Massive beings surrounded her on all sides, their scales creating a kaleidoscope of shifting colors as Dr. Reed presented her solution to the weapon crisis. The quantum resonance web doesn't just contain the energy, Reed explained, her holographic displays floating in the chamber center. It redirects it, creating a self-sustaining loop that actually powers its own containment field. Impossible, one of the collective elders rumbled, their scales pulsing with dismissive reds. The power requirements are reduced by 70%. Reed interrupted, bringing up new data streams. Because we're not fighting the energy anymore, we're working with it. Raven watched the elders' reactions, noting how their scale patterns shifted between skepticism and interest. Beside her, Thera remained motionless, but their scales showed subtle patterns of tension. The ship's emergency comm system suddenly crackled to life. "Commander," Lieutenant Jin's voice was tight with urgency. "We have multiple unauthorized launches from the Viridian vessel. Energy signatures match. Weapons platforms." The gleaming hull of the UES Horizon cut through the darkness of space like a knife through silk. Commander Raven Nash stood at the observation deck, her dark eyes fixed on the swirling nebula ahead. At 42, she'd seen her fair share of cosmic wonders. But this was different. The Cassiopeia Nebula wasn't just beautiful, it was occupied. "Commander," Lieutenant Owen Parker's voice crackled through the comm. "The Viridian vessel is approaching. They're bigger than we expected." Raven allowed herself a small smile. "They're always bigger than we expect, Parker." She turned away from the viewport, her steps measured and calm as she made her way to the bridge. The Viridians were the newest spacefaring species humanity had encountered, and possibly the most intriguing. The bridge buzzed with nervous energy as Raven entered. The main screen showed the approaching Viridian ship, its organic-looking design a stark contrast to the clean lines of human vessels. The alien craft was easily 3 times the size of the Horizon, its surface rippling with patterns that seemed to shift like living tissue. "Report," Raven commanded, settling into her captain's chair. "Viridian vessel maintaining steady approach vector," Lieutenant Jin reported from the tactical station. "Their energy signatures are stable, weapons systems dormant." "Open a channel," Raven ordered, straightening her uniform. The screen flickered, and she found herself staring at a being that made her breath catch in her throat. The Viridian commander was massive, nearly 9 feet tall, with iridescent scales that shifted colors like oil on water. 4 arms were folded across a broad chest, and compound eyes that resembled cut gemstones studied her with unnerving intensity. "I am Thera, first speaker of the Viridian Collective." The alien's voice resonated through the bridge, surprisingly melodic despite its size. "We accept your invitation for diplomatic exchange." Raven rose from her chair, a gesture of respect she'd learned was important to larger species. "First speaker Thera, I am Commander Raven Nash of the United Earth Ship Horizon. Welcome to human space." The conversation that followed was a careful dance of diplomatic niceties, but Raven couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The Viridians were too perfect, too polished. Every response seemed calculated, every gesture precisely measured. "We would be honored to host a delegation aboard the Horizon," Raven offered, following the diplomatic protocol that had been drilled into her. "Our environmental systems can be adjusted to match your atmospheric requirements." Thera's scales rippled with colors Raven couldn't quite interpret. "We accept, Commander. Though I must warn you, our size has caused complications in previous diplomatic exchanges." "We've made appropriate accommodations," Raven assured them, though her mind raced through the logistics. The Horizon's corridors were spacious by human standards, but a 9-foot Viridian would still need to duck. As preparations for the delegation began, Raven retreated to her ready room. "Computer, display all available data on Viridian physical capabilities." The holographic display filled with information, most of it theoretical. Enhanced strength, regenerative abilities, and most concerning, natural armor that could withstand small arms fire. "Thinking of starting a fight?" Dr. Jasmine Reed, the ship's xenobiologist, entered without knocking, a habit Raven had given up trying to break. "Just being thorough," Raven replied, studying a diagram of viridian musculature. "Something doesn't add up, Jasmine. Why would a species this physically superior need diplomatic relations with us?" Jasmine settled into a chair, her dark curls bouncing as she shook her head. "Not everything is about physical superiority, Raven. Maybe they see something in us that we don't see in ourselves. Or maybe they're planning something we're not seeing at all," Raven muttered, but she kept that thought to herself as she prepared to receive their guests. The Viridian delegation arrived with precision and ceremony. 6 of them, each nearly as impressive as Thera, ducking slightly to enter the Horizon's main hangar. Raven watched as her crew tried not to stare at the aliens' shifting colors and impressive stature. As she stepped forward to greet them formally, Raven caught something in Thera's compound eyes, a flicker of what might have been concern, or perhaps fear. It was gone in an instant, replaced by the same diplomatic polish, but it was enough to confirm Raven's suspicions. The Viridians were hiding something, and she was going to find out what it was, even if it meant risking the first major human Viridian diplomatic contact. Because in her experience, secrets in space had a way of getting people killed. "Welcome aboard the Horizon," Raven said aloud, while her mind raced through contingencies. "Let us show you what humanity has to offer." Raven allowed herself a grim smile as the channel opened. They had one chance to prevent catastrophe, and it would take everything both species had learned about each other to succeed. The face that appeared on the Horizon's main screen was like an older, battle-scarred version of Thera. First Elder Voron's scales shifted with complex patterns of disdain as they regarded the bridge crew. "So," their voice resonated through the speakers, "my former student allies with humans to destroy our sacred duty." "Your sacred duty is to protect life," Thera responded, their massive forms straightening. "What you propose is mass extinction. Sometimes the forest must burn for new growth to flourish." Voron's scales pulsed with zealous conviction. "The weapon will cleanse." With all due respect, Raven interrupted, rising from her chair. "That's garbage, and you know it. You're not preserving anything. You're choosing death because you're afraid of change." The First Elder's scales flashed dangerous patterns. "You dare? Challenge you?" "Yes, I do." Raven's voice carried the authority of someone who had earned their command. "By your own ancient laws, I challenge you to ritual combat. If we win, you stand down and let us implement our solution." Voron's compound eyes gleamed. "And when you lose?" "If we lose," Raven emphasized the word, "we'll withdraw, and you can face the consequences of your actions knowing you at least won honorably." The massive alien studied her for a long moment. "You would risk everything on combat." "I already proved myself against your champion," Raven reminded them. "But this time, I propose something different. A joint challenge. Thera and I, fighting together against your chosen warriors. After all, isn't that what this is really about? Proving whether our species can truly work together." The bridge was silent as Voron considered. Finally, their scales shifted to a formal pattern. "The challenge is accepted. Prepare for boarding." As the channel closed, Dr. Reed spoke up from her station. "Commander, we have less than 10 minutes before the cascade becomes irreversible. If they're stalling." "They're not," Thera interjected, their scales showing certainty. "The ritual combat challenge is sacred. Even the purists won't violate that." "Besides," Raven added, checking her tactical gear, "we're not going to lose." The Horizon's cargo bay, still bearing marks from the previous challenge, quickly filled with both crews. 3 massive purist warriors stood ready, their scales showing aggressive patterns. Raven looked tiny next to them, but her stance was confident as she moved to stand beside Thera. "Remember what we practiced," she muttered. "Size isn't everything." Indeed, Thera's scales rippled with what might have been amusement. "Though I still question the physics of your plan." "That's because you're thinking like a Viridian," Raven grinned. "Time to think like a human." Voron's voice boomed through the cargo bay. Begin. The three purist warriors moved with coordinated precision, their massive forms creating a triangle of attack. But Raven and Thera were already moving, implementing a strategy that combined both their strengths. Raven darted between the warriors' legs, forcing them to divide their attention. Meanwhile, Thera engaged directly, their superior size matching the attackers. But instead of following traditional Viridian combat forms, they adapted, incorporating the unpredictable movements Raven had taught them. "This is not the way of our ancestors," one warrior bellowed, swinging at Thera. "Our ancestors," Thera replied, catching the blow while Raven used their arm as a springboard, "would have wanted us to survive." The fight became a dance of precision and adaptation. Raven used the warrior's size against them, while Thera provided the power they couldn't ignore. When one purist would focus on Raven, Thera would create an opening. When they turned to Thera, Raven would strike at vulnerable points. 3 minutes to cascade initiation. Reed's voice came through the comm. Raven caught Thera's eye. Time for the final. Their scales shifted to match her determination. Ready. What happened next would become legend in both human and Viridian space. Raven ran straight at Thera, who caught her with 2 of their 4 arms and began to spin. The centrifugal force combined with precise timing sent Raven flying in a controlled arc, her smaller size allowing for speeds the Viridians couldn't match. She hit the first warrior from above, using their own armor plates as handholds to redirect her momentum. The second warrior moved to intercept, but Thera was there, their massive form providing the perfect springboard for Raven's next attack. The cargo bay became a 3-dimensional battlefield, with Raven flying between levels while Thera systematically disrupted the purists' traditional formation. It was chaos theory in motion, human adaptability combined with Viridian power. The chamber erupted in chaos as Raven spun to face Thera. Explain. But Thera's scales had shifted to a pattern she'd never seen before, pure alarm. The purists, they breathed. They would rather destroy everything than accept change. The chamber's massive screens activated, showing several Viridian attack craft heading straight for the nebula weapon. A new voice cut through the chaos, broadcast across all channels. The ancient ways must be preserved. The voice declared, "If we cannot contain the weapon as our ancestors did, then let it cleanse the galaxy of weakness. Let it reset creation itself. They're going to deliberately destabilize the weapon," Reed realized, her eyes wide. The resonance cascade wooled. "End everything," Thera finished, their massive form tensing. Not just this sector. The reaction would spread across the galaxy. Raven was already moving. "Jin, get the horizon ready for immediate launch. Reed, grab everything you need. We're going to stop them." "Commander," one of the collective elders moved to block her path, their massive form looming over her. "This is an internal matter." "This stopped being internal the moment they decided to destroy my galaxy too," Raven snapped. "Now you can either help us save everyone, or you can stand there debating while existence itself unravels. Your choice." The elder's scales rippled with indignation, but Thera stepped forward. "I stand with the human commander. The old ways have wisdom, but they must adapt or die. And I choose adaptation." The next few minutes were a blur of activity. The Horizon's engines roared to life as Raven and her crew raced back aboard, accompanied by Thera and a small group of loyal Viridian warriors. Multiple impacts detected at the weapon containment field, Jin reported as they reached the bridge. Field integrity dropping rapidly. "Reed, start implementing your resonance web," Raven ordered, dropping into her command chair. "Parker, plot an intercept course with those attack craft. Thera, I need to know their weaknesses." "The purists are using older vessels," Thera explained, their scales showing tactical patterns. "They believe newer technology is corruption. Their shields are outdated," Raven finished, a plan forming. "Jin, reconfigure our weapon frequencies to match their old shield harmonics. Parker, get us in close." The Horizon shot through space like an arrow, its more advanced engines quickly closing the gap with the purest vessels. The Nebula weapon pulsed with increasing violence, its energy patterns becoming more chaotic by the second. They're not just trying to destroy the containment field, Reed called from her station. They're trying to trigger a premature cascade. The energy readings air. The ship rocked as enemy fire sliced through space around them. Raven gripped her chair's arms. Return fire. Target their engines only. We need to stop them, not destroy them. Commander, Thera's voice carried an urgent tone. There is something you should know. The Purists, they are led by my former mentor, the one who trained me in the ancient ways. Raven spared them a glance, having second thoughts. No, Thera's scales showed pure determination now. But understanding whom we face may help us find a solution that doesn't require destruction. The bridge crew worked in perfect synchronization, human and Viridian expertise combining as they engaged the Purist vessels. The Horizon's advanced targeting systems, guided by Thera's knowledge of Viridian tactics, began disabling the attacking ships one by one. Resonance web at 40% deployment, Reed reported. But the weapon's energy patterns are becoming increasingly unstable. We need to complete the deployment before. A massive energy surge ripped through space, causing every screen on the bridge to flare with warnings. The Nebula weapon's core had begun to pulse with a deadly rhythm. Cascade initiation in 15 minutes, Reed announced, her voice tight. Once it starts, we won't be able to stop it. Raven studied the tactical display, noting the positions of the remaining Purist ships. They were arranged in a formation she recognized from Thera's earlier tactical briefings, a ritual combat pattern. Thera, she turned to the massive alien. Your mentor, they're following the ancient battle forms, aren't they? Yes. Thera's scales showed understanding dawning. They believe honor in combat. Might be our way in, Raven finished. Jin, open a channel to the Purist leader. Let's give them one last chance to adapt before we have to get really unconventional. As the comm system activated, Raven caught Thera's scale pattern shifting to that now familiar gold of respect. The massive alien nodded slightly. Sometimes, they rumbled softly. The greatest honor is knowing when tradition must evolve. The delegation moved through the ship like a living wave of color and grace, but Raven kept her eyes on Thera. The first speaker's movements were too careful, too controlled, like someone carrying a burden they couldn't afford to drop. As the tour reached the ship's arboretum, Raven noticed Thera lingering near the earth plants, compound eyes fixed on a simple dandelion that had somehow survived in the ship's garden. Even our weeds are resilient, Raven commented, moving to stand. The next 60 seconds were tense as the Horizon's systems engaged, implementing Reed's revolutionary containment solution. The Nebula weapon's chaotic energy patterns gradually shifted, transforming from a threat into a controlled power source. Cascade averted, Reed announced finally. The resonance web is stable. It's working exactly as designed. A collective breath seemed to release through both crews. Raven turned to Thera, whose scales were showing patterns she'd never seen before: hope, pride, and something that might have been joy. Well, first speaker, she smiled up at them. I'd say this qualifies as a successful diplomatic mission. Thera's response was interrupted by Vorin approaching, their massive form somehow less intimidating now. Perhaps, the first elder said slowly, it is we who had forgotten our ancestors' greatest teaching. That strength lies not in refusing to change, but in choosing how to change. The aftermath brought swift changes to both species interactions. The Viridian Collective, impressed by the success of human innovation combined with their ancient knowledge, established new protocols for joint scientific ventures. The Nebula weapon, once a source of fear, became a monument to what different species could achieve together. As the Horizon prepared to return to Earth, carrying the first official Viridian diplomatic delegation, Raven found Thera in the observation deck, watching the contained nebula's new, stable patterns. Your Dr. Reed's solution is elegant, they commented. using the weapon's own energy to power its containment. Our ancestors would have appreciated the poetry. Speaking of poetry, Raven leaned against the viewport. I hear you're writing the official account of this for the collective archives. Indeed. Thera's scales rippled with amusement. Though I find myself using some rather unconventional metaphors. Your influence, no doubt. Good, Raven smiled. Because I have a feeling this is just the beginning. There's a whole galaxy out there, full of problems that need both our species' solutions. Then it is fortunate. Thera's scales shifted to that now familiar gold of respect and friendship, that we have learned to face them together. As the horizon set course for Earth, carrying its mixed crew of humans and Viridians, Raven reflected that sometimes the greatest adventures weren't about conquering the unknown, but about learning to see it through new eyes. And sometimes the strongest bonds were forged not in spite of differences, but because of them. The stars stretched before them, full of possibilities as humanity and the Viridians began their journey not as separate species, but as partners in the great dance of cosmic exploration.